April 9, 1865. The guns went silent. Lee surrendered. The Civil War over. 4 years. 620,000 dead. Cities burned. Families shattered. A nation that had tried to tear itself in half. And the man who won sat alone in a quiet room and wept. Not Lee, Grant, the winner. The general who had hunted Robert E. Lee across the entire state of Virginia sat in that chair, stared at the empty seat across from him, and felt something no victory ever prepares you for: grief. Not relief, not pride, not triumph. Grief. 20 years later, dying of throat cancer, barely able to speak, racing to finish his memoirs before death took him, Grant wrote words that still make historians go cold. My feelings were sad and depressed. I felt like anything rather than rejoicing at the downfall of a foe who had fought so long and valiantly and had suffered so much. The man who just won the Civil War felt like he had lost. Now here is the question nobody asks about Appomattox. What happens when the most powerful man in the room chooses sorrow over celebration, and that one private moment of grief ends up holding an entire nation together for 161 years? This is that story. To understand Grant's state of mind on April 9th, you have to rewind just 2 days. April 7th, 1865. Lee's army was done. Not strategically done, literally done. His men were boiling leather belts, their own belts, trying to extract whatever thin nutrition the material might give. Desertions weren't trickling, they were flooding. Hundreds of men a day just walking away from the colors, heading home. Done. Richmond had fallen, the capital of the Confederacy, gone. Supply lines were phantoms. Lee fled west, but Grant's cavalry, Sheridan's hard riders, nipped constantly at his heels. Here is the cold math. Lee had roughly 28,000 men left. Grant had somewhere between 90,000 and 113,000 surrounding him. Escape was impossible. The only real question? Could Grant trap him before Lee linked up with Joe Johnston's 40,000 troops in North Carolina? If Lee slipped through, the war dragged on. More battles, more bodies, more Virginia countryside soaked in blood. That possibility ate at Grant. He wasn't thinking strategy anymore. The military picture was settled. He was obsessed with one thing: ending it. Now, this week, today, if God allowed. But Grant's body had other plans. In his memoirs, he wrote it simply: "I was suffering very severely with a sick headache." Not just a headache, a full migraine, the kind that had chased Grant his whole military life. Debilitating, nauseating, half-blinding. Picture this: Grant's head pounding like a drum, but he saddles up anyway, because that's Grant. That night, April 8th, he soaked his feet in scalding water mixed with mustard powder, mustard plasters plastered to his neck and wrists. Crude 1860s remedies, probably useless, but he had to try something. He spent the night in agony, waiting for dawn. But here's the thing about that migraine: it wasn't just a headache. It was the bill coming due, fields of boys who never came home, all that grief compressed into one man's skull. 4 years of ordering men to charge, to hold, to die, then doing it again the next morning before the last morning's blood had dried. That kind of weight doesn't stay locked inside the mind forever. It finds a way out. For Grant, it came out as agony behind the eyes, as nausea, as the kind of half-blindness where sunlight feels like a knife. His mind had been refusing to process it. His body had stopped asking permission. He rode out at dawn anyway, still suffering. Every hoofbeat a punishment. Then, around 11 a.m., a courier galloped up hard and thrust a letter into Grant's hands. Lee was requesting a meeting to discuss surrender terms. And then, the body just quit. Grant wrote, "The instant I saw the contents of the note, I was cured." His words. Not a doctor's tidy summary, Grant's own account written 2 decades later, and still as sharp as the morning it happened. The all-night torture, gone, not fading, not easing toward manageable, gone. Between one heartbeat and the next, the body said, "Enough." Think about what that means. Could you celebrate after that? When everything your body had been white-knuckling for 4 years suddenly releases, the moment a scrap of paper tells it the bleeding is stopping? That's not weakness. That's not drama. That's what happens when a man has been running on fumes and stubbornness for weeks on end, and the thing he's been holding his breath for finally arrives. The migraine didn't vanish because he was happy, it vanished because he could finally stop, but relief twisted into something darker as he rode toward McLean House, because now he had to face the man himself. Wilmer McLean never wanted any of this. After a cannonball blasted through his kitchen at Manassas in 1861, he'd packed up his family and moved to sleepy Appomattox, specifically to escape the war. It found him anyway. When it was all over, McLean supposedly looked around his ransacked parlor, officers already prying off souvenirs before the ink was dry, and said, "The war began in my front yard and ended in my parlor." War had found Wilmer McLean twice. He didn't go looking for history. History came looking for him. Lee arrived first, 1 p.m. sharp, tailored gray uniform, new and immaculate, ivory sash, polished boots, sword and gilded scabbard. He looked like defiance dressed in silk, a man holding his dignity together even as everything he'd fought for was turning to ash. Then he sat down and waited, over an hour, alone, in a stranger's parlor, in full dress uniform, sword on his hip, waiting for the man who would dictate the terms of everything he'd spent 4 years fighting for. Don't let anyone tell you an hour can't feel like a lifetime. Not when it's this hour. Not when every minute in that chair is another minute your men are starving in the field outside. Another minute the thing you've refused to admit is overstays officially unfinished. What does a man like Lee do with time like that? He wasn't the kind to pace or wring his hands, not outwardly. He sat still, composed, the way a man looks when he's decided that the performance of dignity is the last thing left he can give his cause. But behind that composure, his aides noted he barely spoke. He stared at the doorway. Every creak of floorboards made him look up. Every set of hoofbeats that faded without stopping made him settle back. This is one of the most quietly devastating details of the entire war. A great general, alone in a parlor, waiting to be told his life's work is finished. Grant, meanwhile, was still miles away, finishing the mechanics of the trap. He didn't make Lee wait on purpose. He was simply that consumed with ending it cleanly, which tells you everything about both men. Lee, for whom ceremony and appearance were armor. Grant, for whom the only thing that mattered was getting the job done. Grant arrived around 1:30 p.m., mud up to his knees, private's blouse, general's stars sewn on in a hurry, trousers plastered with Virginia clay, no sword. He looked like a man who'd slept in a ditch for a week chasing a legend who'd had time to iron his clothes, which is almost exactly what had happened. They shook hands. Grant studied Lee's face. Lee was composed, unreadable, what Grant later called impassible. But Colonel Ely Parker caught what Grant couldn't quite name. Parker was Grant's military secretary, and one of the most remarkable men in the Union Army, a Seneca Indian, a trained lawyer, a man who had been told repeatedly that the Army had no use for him, and who kept showing up anyway until Grant personally overrode the rejections. He was the quiet force at Grant's elbow throughout the war, and he missed nothing. In that parlor, while everyone else was watching the handshake, Parker was watching Lee's face. He noticed Lee's lips trembling slightly as he held Grant's hand. Eyes averted just a fraction, the small physical betrayals of a man watching his entire world burn. Parker later said it was the most remarkable thing he had ever witnessed, not the surrender itself, but the split second when Lee's composure cracked and showed what was underneath. Outside, Lee's son Custis waited. When Lee emerged, Custis would later describe his father's face as ghastly, a man who had just watched Virginia aristocracy, the whole system of honor and hierarchy he'd been born into, reduced to a signature on paper. But before any of that, before the documents, something unexpected happened. They started talking. Not as enemies, as old soldiers. Mexico, 1846, Monterey, Chapultepec. Both of them had been there. Grant as a young lieutenant, Lee as a dashing captain already building his legend. They'd stood on the same ground under enemy fire. They'd shared danger. They'd laughed at the same officers. For several minutes, the Civil War, 4 years, hundreds of thousands of dead, just fell away, two old soldiers trading memories. Then Lee pulled them back. "General Grant, on what terms do you propose to receive the surrender of my army?" Grant flushed. He admitted it himself later. Embarrassment hit him hard. He was about to dictate the end of a legend. Lee had nearly shattered the Union at the Wilderness. He'd inflicted losses that would have broken any other commander. He'd conjured impossible victories out of nothing. Chancellorsville, Second Bull Run, a dozen others. Respecting a man that much made victory feel almost obscene. Yet Grant's pen moved with a generosity that shocked everyone when the terms became public. Officers could keep their sidearms, no public disarming, no humiliation, no treason trials, no executions. Men could keep their personal baggage and walk home. When Lee pressed further, "Most of our men are farmers. They'll need their horses to plow come spring." Grant didn't blink. "I'll issue a separate order. Any soldier who owns a horse or mule can keep it." 25,000 Confederate soldiers kept their mounts. And Grant granted something else that made Northern politicians howl. He issued 25,000 rations to feed Lee's starving army. Too soft, the newspapers screamed, rewarding treason. But Grant understood something the armchair critics didn't. Starving men become guerrillas. Horses mean plowed fields. Plowed fields mean crops. Crops mean families can eat through winter. Fed families don't spend the next decade in armed insurgency. A paroled Confederate private wrote about those horses years later. "General Grant's generosity saved us from anarchy. With mules, we could plow. Without that gift, the South would have descended into chaos, and we'd still be fighting." This mercy didn't come from triumph. It came from sorrow. Grant had seen Lee's valor, fighting brilliantly, stubbornly, fiercely against odds that would have broken anyone else, commanding men so starved they boiled their own belt leather for soup, and still coming. And now Grant was looking at where that got them. A broken man across a table, a generation of boys scattered in the dirt of Virginia and Pennsylvania and Tennessee. Victory tasted like ashes. At 4 p.m., Lee stood. He bowed to Grant. He bowed to the other Union officers. Then he turned and walked to the door. He mounted Traveler. The hoofbeats faded into the Virginia afternoon, growing quieter, more distant, until they were gone. The chair emptied. The space where Lee had sat seconds ago, a man still commanding some gravity even in defeat, now stood vacant, a void heavier than cannon fire. Union officers would later scramble to grab the chairs as souvenirs. One sits in the Smithsonian today. But Grant didn't look at the furniture. He was looking at the empty space itself, the absence, the end of something vast and terrible and somehow magnificent. He had already ordered silence for Lee's ride. No cheers, no taunts, no demonstrations of victory. Mud squelching under Union boots. That was all. Confederates passed through Union lines in quiet, their defeat acknowledged, their courage recognized. Then news tore through Union camps faster than any telegraph. Lee surrendered. The response was primal. Cannons fired 100-gun salutes. 4 years of hell. Shiloh's 23,000 dead in a single weekend. Gettysburg's fields carpeted in blue and gray. Cold Harbor where 13,000 Union soldiers fell in hours. All of it finally over. Soldiers danced. Soldiers collapsed and wept. Brothers who'd thought they'd die on Virginia soil suddenly had a future again. Then Grant's courier galloped through camp with an order that silenced everything. The war is over. The rebels are our countrymen again. The best sign of rejoicing after the victory will be to abstain from all demonstrations in the field. Artillery silenced mid-roar. Cheers cut off. Why? Why would Grant dampen the moment every one of those men had bled for? Because he understood something most victors never figure out. Celebration wounds deeper than bullets. Lee's men, farmers, conscripted boys, brothers in gray, were marching home hungry and broken. Taunts breed resentment. Resentment breeds guerrillas, and guerrillas breed shadow wars that last decades. Grant had thought about what happened after Napoleon's defeat. Europe spent 30 years in cycles of vengeance and counter-vengeance. He was determined the South wouldn't walk that road. Decades later, a paroled Confederate wrote, "Grant's order let us keep our heads high. No jeers, no humiliation. We went home as men, not as whipped dogs." That made all the difference in how we rebuilt. That made reconciliation possible. 3 days later, April 12, 1865, something extraordinary happened that nobody planned. 28,000 Confederate soldiers assembled to stack their weapons. Think about what that actually looked like. Column after column of ragged men, some barefoot, many in uniforms so threadbare you could see skin through the fabric, marching in to lay down the rifles they'd carried for 4 years. Their battle flags, sewn by mothers and wives and sisters back home, carried through Chancellorsville and Antietam and 100 smaller engagements, being surrendered, folded, handed over, gone. The ceremony was supposed to be cold, disarming, humiliation choreographed into ritual. Instead, Brigadier General Joshua Chamberlain, the college professor from Maine who'd held Little Round Top at Gettysburg against everything thrown at him, who'd been shot through the hip at Petersburg and was already being spoken of as one of the war's great heroes, made a call on his own, without orders, without permission. He turned to his bugler and gave the command. Carry arms, a full military salute, not mockery, not theater, a genuine formal recognition of soldiers, by soldiers. The kind of salute you give men you respect, regardless of what uniform they wore. Confederate General John B. Gordon was at the head of the column, ramrod straight, mounted, the last of Lee's proud lieutenants, leading his men into surrender. He heard the command ripple down the Union line. He saw the rifles snap up in salute. And in one fluid motion, Gordon wheeled his horse, touched his sword to the tip of his boot, and dipped it. A full, formal return of salute. Honor acknowledged. Honor returned. Electric silence rippled through the field. Confederates who'd braced themselves for jeering crowds found only quiet respect. Men who'd expected humiliation found themselves being treated as soldiers. Several Confederate veterans wrote about that moment decades later. One said he'd come expecting to feel shame and left feeling something he couldn't quite name, not pride exactly, something quieter, recognition. That moment, born entirely from the atmosphere Grant had set 3 days earlier, may have done more to prevent a generation of insurgency than any policy Congress ever passed. But Grant wasn't resting, he wasn't savoring anything. April 10th, one day after Lee's surrender, he approached Lee again, not to gloat, to think ahead. General Lee, will you send word to Johnston in North Carolina, to Beauregard in Alabama? Your word alone could end this everywhere, not just here. Lee declined. He felt he had no authority over other commanders. But the fact that Grant asked, within hours of the war's effective end, already trying to prevent the next month of bloodshed, tells you everything about his state of mind. He wasn't celebrating, he was already thinking about the next problem, and it worked. Within weeks, every major Confederate army surrendered. Johnston in North Carolina, Taylor in Alabama, Kirby Smith in the Trans-Mississippi. No prolonged insurgency, no guerrilla campaigns bleeding on for years. The war truly ended, not just at Appomattox, but everywhere. Now think about the road not taken. What if Grant had demanded humiliating terms, pushed for treason trials, let his men celebrate while Lee's soldiers shuffled home through jeering crowds? It's not a crazy hypothetical. There was enormous political pressure on Grant to do exactly that. Radical Republicans in Congress were furious at the generosity of the Appomattox terms. They wanted Confederate leaders tried for treason. They wanted public, visible punishment that would make clear the South had not just lost a war, but forfeited its dignity along with it. Thaddeus Stevens, one of the most powerful men in Congress, called Grant's terms a disgrace. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton barely contained his anger. The political winds were blowing hard toward vengeance. Grant held his ground, and history gives us plenty of examples of what happens when victors choose the other road. France's brutal peace terms after the Franco-Prussian War in 1871 stripped Alsace-Lorraine and demanded crushing reparations. The resulting resentment simmered for 40 years and helped poison the atmosphere that led to World War I. And when Germany lost that war, the Treaty of Versailles repeated the same mistakes at even greater scale. You know how that ended. Occupations that treat a defeated people as permanent enemies don't create peace. They create insurgencies that outlive everyone who started them. Grant chose Lincoln's road instead, malice toward none, with charity for all. And here is what that choice actually produced. Historians put parole compliance at somewhere between 90 and 95%, an extraordinary number given the scale. Nearly every Confederate soldier honored the terms. Tens of thousands of men could have gone home, organized, and made Virginia ungovernable for a decade. They didn't. Why not? Because Grant's mercy had shown them that surrender meant going home, not a firing squad. It meant keeping your horse. It meant your dignity was still intact. It meant your family could eat next spring. You don't fight a shadow war against a man who fed your starving army and sent you home on your own horse. Years after the war, paroled Confederate General James Longstreet, Lee's old war horse, the man who'd thrown everything he had against Grant's armies in some of the war's bloodiest fights, sat across from Grant at a White House dinner. Two men who tried to destroy each other's armies for 4 years, now passing a bottle of brandy and talking about the future. This became the pattern. Former enemies in government together, ex-Confederates in Grant's own cabinet. The peace that grew from Grant's grief became the template for a nation that, against all the odds of its recent history, actually tried to put itself back together. Victory's void didn't fade. It followed Grant for the rest of his life. His memoirs began in 1884. Grant racing throat cancer to the finish line, knowing his family's financial future depended on the book selling. He returned to April 9th again and again. He couldn't stop processing it. He'd orbit back to Appomattox the way a man revisits a wound that never quite closed. He wrote, "I am thankful to see for myself the happy harmony that has sprung up between those engaged but a few short years ago in deadly conflict." He'd lived to see it. Reunions where blue and gray clasped hands across the same blood-soaked ground, joint commemorations, former enemies becoming colleagues. He'd lived to see the peace he'd chosen hold. When Congress pushed for harsh Reconstruction, military occupation, voter disenfranchisement, public punishment of Confederate leadership, Grant pushed back. He vetoed bills, argued for amnesty, not softness, not naivety, strategy. He had learned at Appomattox that punishing a defeated people is just a longer way of losing. Reintegration requires respect. When ex-rebel General George Pickett's wife came begging pardon for her husband, Pickett, the general who had ordered 12,000 men uphill into Union guns in a single afternoon at Gettysburg, Grant granted it quietly. He was a gallant man, he said. That was all. Lee didn't live to see the peace Grant built, broken by defeat, aged beyond his 58 years. Lee died in 1870, just 5 years after Appomattox. Grant spoke of him with consistent admiration in the years that followed. Never with bitterness, never with the contempt of a victor who needed his enemy diminished to feel good about himself. He understood, maybe better than anyone alive, what Lee had carried, what it costs a man to watch everything he built and believed in turn to ash, and still show up, still hold composure, still bow graciously to the man who took it from him. When Grant wrote his memoirs Against Cancer's Clock, he kept returning to one truth. Sadness at victory isn't weakness, it's wisdom. I felt like anything rather than rejoicing at the downfall of a foe. And that feeling, that deep reluctance to celebrate another man's ruin, shaped a peace that held for 161 years. Grant's real victory wasn't defeating Lee militarily. Any general with 100,000 men against 28,000 starving ones could have done that. His real victory was seeing Lee as human after defeat, choosing mercy when he had every right and plenty of political pressure to choose vengeance, understanding that military victory alone doesn't end wars. Psychological victory does. He finished those memoirs days before he died, barely able to speak, writing in longhand because his throat was gone. He knew what he was leaving behind. Not just a military history, a record of what it looks like when a man chooses the harder, quieter, more human path, and what that choice can build. The empty chair in McLean's parlor, the space where Lee sat before walking out, became something larger than one man's absence. It became a symbol of capacity, the capacity of a nation to heal, when its victor chooses sorrow over celebration. So here's the question I want you to sit with. What moment in this story shifted something for you? Was it Grant's migraine, vanishing the instant Lee's letter arrived? Anxiety releasing the moment certainty came? Was it that agonizing hour Lee spent waiting alone in that parlor? Was it the empty chair itself? Chamberlain's salute? The paroled rebels going home with their horses and their dignity? Or was it watching Lee ride away in silence, while Union soldiers stood there and said absolutely nothing? Drop it in the comments. Tell us which moment hit you. Civil War history is best argued by people who understand its soul. Subscribe if you haven't already.